This week in Sci-Fi, we've got our eye on 2022 is off to a great start for sci-fi. Jean-Luc is back in a big year for Star Trek. Behind the screens, we talk to a sci-fi author. And which sci-fi escaped COVID and which didn't. Welcome to Eye on Sci-Fi, I'm Raymond Pedora. This week sees Season 3 of Snowpiercer hitting screens. The Sci-Fi on Rails series picks up from Season 2's explosive finale, and the trailer suggests there will be no let-up in the action. Audience response to the series has been so positive, the studio has already confirmed Season 4. Snowpiercer releases weekly from January 25 on Netflix. And the Mortal Kombat movie comes to Netflix this week after being released in cinemas last April. It's been 24 years since the release of the fighting video game, and the movie sees an MMA fighter searching for Earth's greatest champions to compete in a deadly martial arts tournament against the Outworld. The movie bombed with critics, but it was still HBO's most successful movie launch to date. Sci-fi comedy Resident Alien returns to screens with Season 2. Firefly's Alan Tudyk continues his adventures as an extraterrestrial adapting to life in small-town America. Season 2 will be available on local streaming platform 9 Now, and despite their free-to-air TV roots, it looks like we're getting this pretty much in real time, available from January 27. Catching up on the summer break, and The Eternals was released on Disney Plus after a run in cinemas. Chloe Zhao's film follows a new group of MCU heroes who have protected the Earth since the dawn of man. Their services haven't been needed for some time until creatures known as the Deviants mysteriously return and the Eternals reunite to defend humanity once again. Last year, we previewed MORBIUS, which should have hit cinemas last week. It now looks like it won't be seen in Australia until the end of March, something else we can probably thank COVID for. And looking ahead now, dates have been released for new sci-fi in 2022. Season 2 of Upload hits Amazon on March 11. In this comedy drama, heaven is actually the metaverse, and the story picks up as a recently deceased, or is that uploaded, software developer becomes suspicious about the circumstances of his death. Paramount Plus has announced that hotly anticipated Star Trek series Strange New Worlds will be released on May 5th and has already been renewed for Season 2. This series follows the adventures of the Enterprise before Captain Kirk took the center seat and marks a return to a more traditional story of the week format. At this stage, we're expecting Strange New Worlds to be available in Australia on Paramount Plus, but given ongoing confusion between services locally, we'll keep you updated. And while we're in the Star Trek universe, Jean-Luc will be back March 3rd with the release date of Picard Season 2 just confirmed by Paramount. This season has a time travel theme, and it's a good bet that Q, with John Delancey reprising the role, has something to do with it. Another Next Generation favourite joins the show, with Whoopi Goldberg's Guinan apparently helping Picard unravel whatever has happened to the timeline. And the trailer features glimpses of the Borg Queen, so plenty to work with there. We're expecting Season 2 to hit Australian screens the same day on Paramount Plus. Just before the break, we asked for feedback on what you'd like to see on the show in 2022. Thank you to everyone who's responded. The results so far are really encouraging. We'll keep that poll active for one more week, so get in and vote if you haven't already. Joining me now is sci-fi author C.S. Cooper, who's currently working on a sequel to his book, The Final Flight of the Ranaga. Thanks for joining us, Craig.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. So let's get straight into it. So at Eye on Sci-Fi, we focus a lot on screen movies and television, but could you tell us about how important novels are to sci-fi?
Well, I'd say they're really important because, like with the recent success of the new Dune adaptation, Dune started as a story a guy visioned in his head, and simply using pen and paper, or probably a typewriter in his case, he created this world through words. Now, anyone can do that, but it takes that seed, it takes that and plants the seed of what becomes massive visual representations of these invented worlds. And so you'd say, even if it's even if it's not a novel, if it's a screenplay someone's written, it's still entire worlds made out of words. And so, yeah, I'd say it's extremely important.
And as a writer, how would you describe your sci-fi to a new reader?
That's actually a very good question, because I never thought of that. Usually, when I was first learning how to sell my book, I simply called people over and say, hey, this is my sci-fi fantasy novel. Have a look and check it out. But one of my friends read it, and one of the things she described it as, and it was quite interesting, she said, it doesn't feel like regular sci-fi. It doesn't feel like sci-fi. This feels like something completely different. It feels almost like Firefly, but in the outback. And so a lot of people who read it, they describe it as feeling very different from the sci-fi they're used to. So I don't know, maybe I've created a whole new way of writing the genre.
Now, there are two existing genres that often go head to head and that fans kind of debate about, which are sci-fi and fantasy. So in your work, how do those two worlds kind of combine?
So the way I usually delineate them is, I say the more speculative a science fiction story is, the more fantastical it is. So the closer to fantasy it becomes. So, for example, you take the movie The Martian, right? You look at that movie, and even the big science fiction and science gurus like Neil deGrasse Tyson, they'll look at that and they will say, yes, this story is completely possible. It is fully possible to happen in our world with the current technology we have. You just need the manpower and the drive to do it. But you look further into the future. You say more speculatively, you add this technology to get over this problem. So this technology to get over the problem of traveling fast through the universe. Well, how does it work? The more speculative you get, the more fantastical it has to become, because you can't really see how the technology would work in the context of our current world and the current scientific understanding. And you might say, well, what about wizards and goblins and ogres? And there's a book on world building that I utilized a great deal when working on my invented universes. It's called The Planet Construction Kit by a man named Mark Rosenfelder. And one of the things he talks about is, how do you distinguish magic from technology? Is magic something innate and spiritual to how people work, or is it some kind of knowledge about the natural world that people can take advantage of that looks like they're just waving a wand? Well, that's the thing. You can consider magic a form of technology that we simply don't understand. Like, I think I can't remember who quoted it, but like they say, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so I think even when it comes to wizards and goblins and ogres, or Jedi and the I can't remember the terms, but the people in the navigators in Dune, they've got kind of magical abilities because they're able to see the universe and navigate. Well, it's still the same thing. It's still a form of technology. We just don't understand it. Or even the Ori in Stargate. You think about them. They're practically godlike beings, but they're not gods. They just have a greater understanding of the universe.
That kind of thinking that you had in regards to the sci-fi and fantasy lines crossing, I feel like those were applied to your Axum series of books.
Yeah.
And you created a world with those books. What were the kind of challenges when you were building it from scratch, this entire universe?
So I've got two universes that I'm writing stories within. So the first book I published was Final Flight of the Runagher, and that is set in an invented universe that I've been working on since I was 12 years old. And that has elements of, well, Star Wars and, yes, Legend of Zelda, video games that I played as a child, and it's sort of amalgamated into as I learnt more about science and I learnt more about this idea of having consistent rules that your universe plays by. It sort of became the world that it is now. And so I call that sci-fi fantasy because it has fantastical elements, but I've tried to incorporate real life technology into it as well. Whereas with the Axom Saga, that was a small series of books written while I was getting Runiger ready for publication. And essentially, I took 3 different Japanese comic books that I really liked, adapted them to different parts of the world. One of them I set in Australia, in Wollongong, of all places. And I merged them into a shared universe using H.P. Lovecraft as the glue. But with Runiger, I wanted to incorporate a lot of real-life technology into it.
And in terms of, when you were creating those technologies and kind of expanding on them, how much research did you have to do and looking into all that kind of stuff?
Well, it was quite a bit of research. So, for starters, the story starts not on the Runiger, which is a derelict, well, it's a legendary starship, but because it's so ancient, it's had to have other ships tacked onto it. You can see it in the cover art. The story actually starts on a ship called the Othala. And it's what's called an O'Neill cylinder, where it's a long cylinder that's spinning to simulate gravity, and people build and live like as if they're living on a planet on the inside of that cylinder. And for that, I took inspiration from an anime called Macross Frontier, which was, it came out in 2008, 2009, and I really enjoyed that one. But in that, there's a ship that has it's constantly recycling biomatter, it's constantly recycling water and air. It's a self-contained ecosystem, and I really liked that concept. And I wondered, has this sort of thing been attempted in real life? So I read stories about experiments that were carried out on this kind of thing, like Biosphere 1, I believe it was called. And it was an attempt to construct a self-contained ecosystem as a model for a colony on Mars. Now, I remember reading, this is how they did the experiment, this is what they experienced, and I noticed, I read about the mistakes they made, the problems they had, but by reading about that, that's how I actually came up with the premise for the start of the story of Final Flight of the Runiger. So by doing the research, like I said, okay, so they had this technology, they had that technology, they had that technology, but this is what happened. This can be the start of my story. So it's not just creating the invented world that you can you do research for, but also you can find out how you progress your story ahead.
The detail that we just talked about is something that, as an author, you have space for within books. But when books are adapted for screen, what would you say happens to that detail?
Quite frankly, a lot of it does have to go out the window. I'm not ignorant of that, and I don't envy the job of people who have to adapt things to the screen. Because I do have experience in screenwriting. I've acted in front of cameras and I've worked behind cameras. And quite often it comes down to there's just not enough screen time to tell the whole story. Sometimes you need to make compromises and say, okay, we can't have that. Maybe we could tweak it slightly so it's within our budget constraints, so it's within our time constraints, and also if you want to make sure your movie can be seen by a general audience, there's also decency considerations and maturity considerations that you need to look to. And you can see it in Lord of the Rings. There is a lot of Lord of the Rings that's cut out, and especially with Saruman. The development of Saruman, there is so much of him that's cut out of Lord of the Rings, but when you're talking about the kind of budget constraints and the time that they had to put in, you can understand why it's not in there. But it's the same thing with Jurassic Park. There's a lot of stuff in there that wasn't in the book, or there was a lot of stuff in the books that didn't go into the movies. Once again, because they're bringing dinosaurs to life.
Well, thank you so much for your insight and your interesting point of view. We haven't had author on before, and that's an amazing perspective to have on a sci-fi related show. So thank you so much for coming on, Craig.
My pleasure, man. Thank you very much for having me on.
Awesome, thank you. You can check out Craig's book at his website. The link is in the video description. And that's the week in sci-fi. Until next week, stay up to date at ionsci-fi.com.